Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's January 12th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. This is our first episode of 2022, and sadly we're starting off the new year on a somber note, as the conservation world lost some giants at the end of 2021. Tom Lovejoy, a conservation biologist who coined the term biological diversity, died on December 25th. And then the next day, E.O. Wilson, a pioneering biologist and author who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his writing about science for a general audience, also passed away. We had both Tom Lovejoy and E.O. Wilson on this very podcast in the past. Back in September of 2018, I spoke with Lovejoy about how deforestation and the impacts of climate change could trigger dieback in the Amazon and other tropical forests around the world, causing them to shift into non-forest ecosystems. He argued that we need to make a paradigmatic shift in how we approach conservation, and that we need to start thinking about and managing the entire planet as a combined physical and biological system.
Forests are incredibly important, of course. They have a lot of exceptionally large amount of carbon in them, but all ecosystems have carbon in them, and the extent to which we restore degraded ecosystems around the world, we get all kinds of other benefits. If they're coastal wetlands, basically you get protection against storm surge, you benefit fisheries. If you restore grasslands and grazing lands, you get better grazing if that's what you want to use them for. And particularly if we restore agricultural ecosystems to the point that they start accumulating carbon in the soils, that actually leads to increased soil fertility. So these are all things that are sensible to do in their own right, but even more so when we're trying to manage the climate system of the planet as a whole.
E.O. Wilson actually appeared on the Mongabay newscast twice. Once in 2017 when he spoke about his Half Earth initiative, which seeks to conserve biodiversity by protecting half of the surface of planet Earth. And he appeared again in 2018 after I'd had the distinct pleasure of meeting Dr. Wilson at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York at a Half Earth Day event. Wilson liked to describe the Half Earth goal as a moonshot, but he told me that as ambitious as the goal might seem, in an age where climate change and biodiversity loss have reached crisis levels, aggressive solutions are required.
We're a little bit like a surgeon or a internist in a hospital. We have a very sick patient. The patient could die on us, so we'd better get busy to find out what ails our patient and what treatments are required to stabilize our patient, and then study our patient so thoroughly that we know what procedure to follow to bring him or her back to full health. And that's essentially what conservationists are doing, and why they are getting more and more interested in new developments of basic science, which is discovering the 80% and classifying the 80% of species out there in the world still unknown, and then developing and coming through with an ecosystems science coupled with determination on the part of people and societies and countries to take what measures are needed to prevent the loss of something that can't be replaced.
Both Lovejoy and Wilson were towering figures in conservation science. Here to help us discuss the legacies they leave behind and where we might look to find the next generation of conservation biology leaders is Rebecca McCaffery, North American president of the Society for Conservation Biology and a wildlife biologist for the United States Geological Survey. McCaffrey tells us about the overarching influence of E.O. Wilson on the world of conservation biology, how his life and legacy have helped inform the work done by the Society for Conservation Biology, and why she doesn't necessarily think we need new conservation icons to lead us into the future. We also speak with Mongabay staff writer Liz Kimbrough, who interviewed E.O. Wilson just a couple months before his passing as he was preparing for the annual Half Earth Day, held on October 22nd to commemorate the publication of his seminal work, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, which gave rise to the Half Earth Project, seeking to realize Wilson's vision of conserving half of the lands and seas on planet Earth in order to safeguard biodiversity. Kimbrough tells us about her conversation with Wilson, what his works have meant to her as both a science writer and a PhD-holding biologist, and where she sees the big ideas and leadership for the conservation biology space coming from in the future. In a piece about E.O. Wilson's passing, Mongabay founder and CEO Rhett Butler noted that while Wilson was a prominent and pioneering biologist whose research was highly influential in scientific circles, he was also a prolific writer of articles and best-selling books that helped raise global awareness and understanding about biodiversity and conservation. Rebecca McCaffery told me that both Wilson and Lovejoy helped raise awareness of the urgent need to preserve the natural world.
I think that the legacies of both Tom Lovejoy and E.O. Wilson were really to bring awareness of biodiversity to a global and more mainstream scale. Of course, they were people involved in first really bringing conservation biology to the forefront, both as a discipline in the work that they were doing, but also in that ability to communicate it really broadly. E.O. Wilson, in particular, through his writings, but both of them through writing and their communications with a broad diversity of scientific and non-scientific audiences.
Are there any of E.O. Wilson's writings that particularly stand out to you?
I wouldn't say there's any book in particular that I've returned to as kind of a guiding light, but I did do a little inventory, and I realized that I have 5 of E.O. Wilson's books, plus an additional edited volume of his in my house. And within my collection of kind of scientific or popular science literature, he's probably the person whose books, who I have the most books from. And so it kind of speaks to the breadth and depth and diversity of his writings, from his sociobiology kind of textbook to this little tome called Letters to a Young Scientist, which I've actually been rereading over the weekend and just kind of being reminded of some of his guiding lights and guiding thoughts towards people coming up in science these days.
Are there any people you look to today as the sort of conservation science leaders of the future on the order of an E.O. Wilson or Tom Lovejoy? Or do you think we've moved more into a post-icon phase of global conservation? Yeah,
I think that what we really had coming with these, these forefathers, these grandfathers or fathers of biodiversity and of the field of conservation biology was really a development of some of these ideas and a crystallizing of these ideas into a form that we now use today. But awareness of the biodiversity crisis and awareness of how forest fragmentation can impact biodiversity, things like that, are no longer the primary challenge. We know that information. And so as we move forward, some of that legacy, that foundational work exists. And so we kind of know sort of what needs to be done. And so we really need this next generation to be a combination of wonderful scientists and ecologists and communicators, and also other conservation leaders that move beyond scientists to our politicians, policymakers, business leaders, and more. So really a diversity of people that might be able to move that agenda forward and move some of the science forward that we now know that has come out of this foundational work.
Well, on that note, tell us about the Society for Conservation Biology and the work y'all are doing there.
So the aim of the Society for Conservation Biology is to advance the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. And that has maintained the same since its founding by Michael Soule and others several decades ago. But what that means in practice has shifted over those decades. So when the field of conservation biology was first developed, there was a lot of work looking at some of the scientific elements of biodiversity, what happens when habitats are fragmented, what is the best way to conserve different sizes of habitat, what happens on the edge of protected and non-protected habitat, and how many individuals do we need within a population or a species to maintain its viability into the future. And some of that foundational work, continues, but we do have a sense as well of some of those questions. And so now we're moving maybe a little bit more into that practice realm and having this fantastic foundation of science that continues, but also, how do we take that information and move it forward?
So, of course, E.O. Wilson created this idea and an initiative called Half Earth to protect half of the planet and thereby safeguard 80% of biodiversity. When I spoke to him for this podcast, he told me he expected to get a lot of criticism of the idea, but that it was mostly met with approval. and that he figured that was because people were looking for this kind of overarching grand goal for how we save life on this planet. And of course, it should be said that there are a lot of critics of the protected area model of conservation, and there is certainly a history of land being set aside and designated as protected, and that leading to the people living on the land losing their access and even facing violence and repression in the name of conservation. But what do you think of Half-Earth and how it fits into the future of conservation?
Well, I think that having an idea like Half-Earth, having those big ideas, an overarching kind of guidepost, or I think Ed Wilson calls it a moonshot, are important pieces. We need to aim as big as we can. And, one of the things that I think has been kind of heartening in the past year has been the kind of mainstreaming of the idea of 30 by 30 within not only the United States and North America, but throughout the world in many countries, which is an effort to conserve 30% of a country's lands and waters by 2030. And that's something that's actually moving through the policy arenas right now. It's not Half-Earth, but it is certainly, a guidepost, again, that can provide us a lot of initiative at a lot of different levels to achieve something big. And that's certainly something that we're thinking about, in our society and guiding some policy and science efforts within the Society for Conservation Biology.
Is there anyone out there now who you think will be bringing those kinds of big overarching ideas and initiatives to the table in the future? Well,
I'm not sure if that's the right question. I think there are a number of fantastic scientists and fantastic communicators. The overlap between fantastic scientists and fantastic communicators can sometimes be relatively narrow. We have some just absolutely amazing science writers, people like David Quammen or Elizabeth Colbert, who are really able to communicate really big issues like the biodiversity crisis, climate change, and pandemics, to a contemporary and broad audience. And we also have just a number of just fantastic conservation scientists and conservation biologists. But, I think that one of the things that's fascinating and just wonderful about our field is that one of the things that we've been thinking about in our society and our Society of Conservation Biology, or conservation science, is really a shift in thinking away from maybe these icons who are very important and will continue to have great legacies, to bring in much more diverse voices. This might include multiple ways of knowing, Indigenous and place-based expertise by the people being affected by environmental change and conservation. And so, I see more that there's a lot of just fantastic place-based work, not one person kind of jet-setting around the planet, working in a ton of different areas, but people that really get to know an individual space, and really an effort to try to have more autonomy in the conservation and in the science taking place and working in different areas.
And it certainly seems like things are moving in that direction. A greater diversity of voices are being listened to, especially the indigenous and local communities who are really on the front lines of conservation, and that conservation is becoming more decentralized. There's greater awareness that top-down strategies don't work, and local communities must be integral to planning and executing on conservation strategies. Is that a fair assessment of the general trajectory of conservation right now, would you say?
Yeah, I think that the idea that every people within local communities and within local landscapes have a voice and have a perspective and have a say in how conservation works is ultimately the idea is that will make it more effective, right? And another area I see conservation kind of moving in is kind of integrating new disciplines outside of conservation biology. Like I said, we have now within the Society for Conservation Biology a number of really fascinating working groups, including conservation marketing, religion and conservation, social science, and participatory and citizen science. And so those are other ways, in the same way that we're thinking about, who are the people, integrating, having people on the ground participate in collecting data or in understanding their systems better, thinking about, again, those different ways of knowing, those different ways that we can communicate and provide incentive and bring people together to conserve these lands and waters.
Well, it's not really a different discipline per se, but technology also seems like it is increasingly being brought to bear on conservation and will play a huge role in the future of conservation.
Yeah, technology certainly has an important role to play. To give a very simple example that, has been around for a little while now, we have these little computers that we carry in our pockets and in our hands all the time, our phones. And, there's so much information kind of at our fingertips that can help people really kind of engage in science and in the natural world around them. For example, being able, applications like eBird or things that help people be able to record what they're seeing in nature or learn about through like iNaturalist, what they're seeing in nature. And so that those are like kind of easy ways where people can really just be able to use technology to connect much more closely, be part of large initiatives to collect information, but also learn more about the world around them. And, again, people are going to care about or want to protect what they care about. And that technology is a way to kind of bring so much of that to people in new ways.
I know you work with Indigenous communities on conservation initiatives in Washington State. Could you tell us about that work?
Yeah. I work on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And the Olympic Peninsula is the whole center of the peninsula is the really stunning and incredible Olympic National Park, and as well as a section of the coastline along the Pacific Ocean is also national park. But then surrounding that is just a whole matrix of national forest, of wilderness, of private lands, of timberlands, and multiple different tribes that live and inhabit and know about these landscapes. And so, I've had the opportunity and the good fortune to interact with multiple different tribal groups around the Olympic Peninsula, and in some cases engaging in some pretty large-scale initiatives, such as the restoration of the Elwha River ecosystem following dam removal, which is incredibly important to the lower Elwha Clallam peoples, as well as restoration of individual species, including the fisher, which is a small carnivore that was reintroduced to the peninsula through a huge collaboration between the state and the park and a number of different groups, including the tribes all around the peninsula, to monitor their return. And so I'm working with the Mccaw on looking at fisher use of their lands. And so, working with these groups is eye-opening. The knowledge that they bring. Yeah, working with these groups has really just given me a new perspective on the peninsula. It's giving me a new perspective on national parks and on the whole landscape and the linkages between, all these different communities and the linkages between the ocean and these mountain landscapes and the different peoples that have inhabited, this peninsula for so long.
I think one important aspect of the legacy of scientists and communicators like E.O. Wilson and Tom Lovejoy is that they inspire people to want to learn more about the planet we live on and even give people hope that we can and will meet the challenges of crises like climate change and biodiversity loss. So, I'm just curious, what gives you hope that we can meet these challenges?
I think, it kind of goes back to some earlier parts of our conversation. You can look at things from a huge global perspective, and sometimes they seem completely overwhelming. But if you look at a local scale, if you look at local communities, and if you look at the local work being done, there are places of incredible hope and incredible optimism. And when you put all those little pieces together, there's just dedicated and passionate and hardworking people in every community that are working towards the conservation of biodiversity and towards the maintenance of sustainable ecosystems going forward. So those are the little things from day to day that give me hope, is the work being done on the ground. And then, hopefully then connecting that to those bigger pieces, those huge initiatives. How does that fit into the concepts of 30 by 30 or half Earth? Well, they all play a role. And so we start with what we can do in our immediate community and what's around us. and we keep our minds open and we work hard, and all those little pieces can add up to something big, I think.
Any final thoughts on the legacies of either E.O. Wilson or Tom Lovejoy that you care to share with us today?
I think one thing that is just a great legacy of probably both of them, but I'll speak again, being more familiar with E.O. Wilson, is that, he still talks about biodiversity as being this great frontier of exploration, that we ultimately know and have cataloged only a small amount of the biodiversity on this planet. And I just think that that's just a fascinating concept to go forward with, that he's still urging that discovery and that exploration and that understanding of what's on our planet, even as we know it's important and we have the tools we need to conserve it, that there's still a place for natural history, for curiosity, and for that kind of fascination for science and discovery, even in some of our most basic understanding of the natural world. And I think that's another great piece of his legacy, again, for anybody to consider who's thinking about going into science.
Now we're going to hear from Mongabay staff writer Liz Kimbrough, who interviewed E.O. Wilson about half-Earth hope and the need for a shift in consciousness just 2 months before he passed away. I asked Liz, as not only a science writer, but also someone who has a PhD in biology, what E.O. Wilson's work had meant to her.
Well, when I heard E.O. Wilson had passed, I sort of felt in a combination of things, because I just interviewed him in October. I interviewed him in the last couple of months of his life, and so I felt saddened, of course, but mostly just very grateful that I got to speak to him. I felt very grateful for his life and his legacy. I mean, he was in his 90s, and when I spoke to him just a few months before he passed, he was still so sharp and such a big thinker and so on point. Really, it was really impressive. I mean, obviously in his 90s, he was a little harder to understand, and went off on some tangents, but even his tangents were pretty brilliant. So I think what's been poignant is here we have one of the world's greatest scientists, certainly one of the world's greatest biologists, and when the news broke, I looked on social media and on Twitter, and people weren't talking as much about his mind and his work. I mean, you saw plenty of that and plenty of tributes, but instead, what you saw were all of these stories about his generosity and his kindness and his thoughtfulness and his influence as a mentor. And so that was particularly powerful to me. I grew up in Alabama, and E.O. Wilson also grew up in Alabama. And so when I first went to college in Northern California, that's when I was introduced to E.O. Wilson's work, because you don't study biology or ecology, at least in the Western world, without learning the name of E.O. Wilson. It's he's like the Beyonce of biology. And he, not just for his theories and his thinking within the fields of biology and his work with ants and the hard science, but really his efforts to bring together multiple disciplines, his big picture ideas, and also just the way that he wrote so beautifully. And so I think my freshman year of college at Humboldt State University, we read Consilience, which is a book that he wrote on the unified theory of knowledge. So he was really trying to bring together everything from ancient art to ecology to physics, and making an argument that these things all center around our biology. And I just remember I think that was the first time I'd been really introduced to interdisciplinary thinking, and to have it done in such a, like a fluid and big way was really powerful. And then to find out that he also grew up in Alabama. And so I was actually able to tell him that when I spoke to him. We had a little bit of time to kill at the beginning of the interview as we were waiting for some other folks to join the call. And I was able to, to tell him that his work was a huge influence on me, and that I also had grown up in Alabama. And he a lot of people don't realize it's actually the fourth most biodiverse state in the country, and there's just beautiful dense forests that are full of life. And he said really being a child and running around in those forests set up his foundation and kind of gave him all he needed to have this immense career. So that, and then another thing that stood out in the interview, and again, this I think reinforces the point that yes, he had all these great ideas and theories, but also just that he was such a human. So at one point in the interview, he said, right as we were speaking, a mouse ran across my path. I've been looking after this little mouse because I just can't bear to dispose of a part of the ecosystem. So he's just joking about this little mouse that lives in his house. And then later on, he was filling someone in that joined the conversation late, and he said, I have this little mouse that runs under me, under the understanding that I'm there and I might try to harm it, but I wouldn't touch that little mouse for anything. That's just an instinct I have, and I'm happy to apply it in my own home. So that was really touching, and of course something that I took away from this interview, that he deeply cares. He deeply cares for all the living things around him.
Yeah, I read your interview, and I remember that part quite clearly because, of course, the perhaps more typical reaction is to get up on a chair and scream or something when a mouse is in your house. But there was E.O. Wilson just casually watching it run by like it was a pet.
Right, like, oh, my little mouse friend. I've been taking care of him. And I don't know if maybe there are other people taking care of the mouse in his house, but knowing that he wouldn't be. He doesn't have the heart to do that. So, and then the other similarity that we had, and he says this comes from his childhood in Alabama. He became pretty obsessed with ants. He's the world's foremost expert on ants, and wrote huge compendiums on ants and ant biology. And I also was kind of obsessed and fascinated with them as a child, and then even on into college, because there's a lot of ants in Alabama. So it's that attention to the tiny, the small. He was really paying attention to all the little things.
So what else did you guys talk about in that interview? Because that must have been one of the last interviews he did.
Yeah. I mean, I believe it probably was one of the last. The interview was we were doing the interview in the lead up to the Half Earth conference. So one of his last, or maybe I believe his last book was called Half Earth, and it's his moonshot idea of that we need to preserve or dedicate half of the world to nature, the world's oceans and forests and ecosystems. And when asked by many people, like, do you really think this is realistic? He said we need a big rallying cry. We need a big idea. We need a moon shoot, and maybe we don't hit it, but we need this big idea. And so the Half Earth conference was a yearly conference that happened around the anniversary of the release of the book. And so in it, there was a conversation between E.O. Wilson and Sir David Attenborough. And so this interview was sort of in lead up to that event. So I believe, that was probably the last true interview he did, was at this conference, the conference honoring his idea and this grand vision that he had. There's a transcript of the last speech that he gave, which is, it's sort of beautiful that we have this. He worked on this speech for a while, and it's sort of one of his last offerings. And he says in it, a few lifetimes from now, and then on for centuries to follow, humanity will be asking, what did we think we were doing? Didn't we realize the damage we are now causing by stripping the planet of our own most precious natural heritage? And he's talking about what he calls the 3 environmental crises, which, are the shortage of fresh water, climate change, and the global loss of biodiversity. And he really argues that biodiversity is the one thing that we can't, when a species goes extinct, when we lose a species, we've lost it. So he felt deeply passionately had a deep passion for expressing the gravity of this. And as they say, extinction is forever. And so I think he really centered his life, or especially like the latter years of his life, around that idea.
So you did that interview with a couple other folks, one of whom was Tim Smith, executive chairman and co-founder of the Eden Project and a moderator for Half Earth Day. He said to you that Ed Wilson will be seen in a generation from now to be equivalent of a Galileo because he has seen something and he has been banging on, and finally the world is waking up. As a PhD biologist yourself, how will you remember him, or what will you remember him most for?
Yeah, certainly this big, grand, vision and the bravery to leap across disciplines and to not be afraid to leave his silo of biology. I mean, he mastered, his field, and he became a world-renowned biologist and taxonomist, but he, often in academia, people stay in their silos, and the system is really set up to benefit people who specialize, but he was really able to use his position and his privilege and his courage to kind of take the leap to bring together lots of ideas. And then to, it's a big statement to say we need to save half of the earth. And of course that was not without criticism. There's obviously, there are issues with conservation models that are focused on land area protection. But, when I spoke to his foundation director, Paula Ellerick, she was pretty clear that what they mean by that isn't to, of course, displace indigenous or traditional people from their lands in order to preserve the forest. But obviously these people are the best stewards of this land and are, some of our greatest teachers. And that this vision of Ed's was to make sure that those land rights are protected and that land tenure and, was bolstered, and that these are some of the priorities. So I guess I'm just impressed by the journey that he took as a scientist and a thinker. And then once again, that despite, all of his, Pulitzer winning books and hundreds of publications and emeritus status at Harvard and all of these impressive things, that he over and over took the time to mentor people, to be kind, even in this interview with me, to really take the time to talk to me about where we both grew up and to tell me about this mouse. So I think that he was able to keep his humanity so intact, despite working in the realm of both academia and conservation for a lifetime. He was able to keep hope, is sort of a beacon of hope for the rest of us.
Do you think there's another E.O. Wilson out there right now, someone who will have as big an impact on the world of conservation biology as he did? Or, where would you look for such a leader to come from in the future?
I'm not sure about who currently is, though. I think if I had a moment, I could come up with all kinds of names. I mean, I think there are many more because access to education and knowledge and the internet is just broadened who has, obviously E.O. Wilson's a 90-year-old white man from Alabama who was able to go to Harvard, and he's very aware and has acknowledged that was a great privilege and a great bit of luck to be born at the time that he was. But I guess any kid has the potential, given the right environment and the right access and the right nurturing, the exposure to nature, to turn into an E.O. Wilson. Obviously now that the future E.O. Wilson could be anywhere in the world. And I think something that's exciting is just seeing more diversity and inclusion and belongingness, in the sciences and in academia, because this idea of consilience that E.O. Wilson, brought forward, of the jumping together of disciplines. Well, there's more than just academic disciplines, and there's more than just these Western categories of art and science and humanities. There's whole ways of thinking that are embedded in indigenous knowledge and indigenous languages and in different cultures. And so, as we start to, as they say, decolonize science and bring, all kinds of people into the fold or the unfold, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what comes of that. I'm glad that science is moving out of the halls of Harvard a bit.
So obviously he had the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation and the Half Earth Project housed within that foundation. But are there any other organizations or movements you see as really carrying forward his legacy?
As I said, you can't really be in the field of biology or ecology in the West and not in some way be touched by by his work. So I think it's carried out in all of the Ecological Society of America and the Society for Conservation Biology and animal behavior and taxonomy and all of these things. So I think it just, he's infused himself into the bedrock of modern biology, and we're all carrying on his work. What I think is more important to see carried on is his optimism and humanity and grand vision of continuing to bring together many ways of thinking. So I hope that that's a true legacy that we see from E.O. Wilson.
Are there any particular books or articles or even just quotes of his that you particularly think of when you think of his optimism and his humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate in college in several classes we read, excerpts from several of his books, like The Future of Life is particularly beautiful, and Consilience, and so this is from E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience. He says, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely," which I think really summarizes what he did well. And then another legacy is just he was an entomologist, and he was one of the first people to, first of many and many of his colleagues to, rally the cry around like the great loss of insects and what that means for the environment and for global collapse. He says, this is one of his quotes, is, "If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos." So, I've done quite a bit myself, and also Jeremy Hance and others at Mongabay have done a bit of writing about the great insect apocalypse, and he was pretty fundamental to that cry.
So we were talking about E.O. Wilson's optimism. What gives you a sense of optimism about the future?
My job is to interview people, experts, and people around the world that have been studying this and thinking about this and dedicating their lives for decades to these questions. And I think what gives me hope is that we do have the solutions. Like we know what we need to do, and there seems to be a pretty big consensus that this is reducing emissions and protecting the land, the wild lands and forests and oceans that we have, so stopping the destruction of what's intact and reducing emissions. And, so E.O. Wilson's grand vision of the 50%. So, obviously saving what we have and then continuing to restore, rewild, regenerate other ecosystems, appropriately. It seems to be the direction people are saying that we need to go. The experts are saying we need to go. And it's tricky because I think what stands in the way is, the human mind and ego and political will. And those things they can be tough to shift, but it's not impossible, and knowing that there's, people carrying on this idea and this legacy of these big targets, and that, we've seen more and more commitments to these targets of protecting large areas of land and regenerating land is a reason to hope. We know what to do. We just have to do it. And it's happening. Yeah. It's happening. There's so many people that have dedicated their whole life to this work. And, that's really heartening to see. And that surprisingly, most of the people I interview still remain optimistic.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.